Edward II. Now, if Edward II died the way it's been suggested he did, then this has to go down as one of the most unpleasant and violent murders you could imagine, even by medieval standards. So let's look at his backstory. Edward became King of England in 1307 and ruled for almost 20 years before his death in 1327 while he was in his early 40s. His reign was filled with problems, many of which came from him having such close relationships with his male favourites. It was never a good thing for a king to be too close to any individual man, as it would lead to jealousy and fear that that individual would become too powerful. Piers Galveston had such a close bond with the king that it led to him getting many enemies, and it didn't help that Piers could act in a very arrogant and overconfident way. Even at the king's wedding, it's said that Piers had little respect for the new Queen Isabella of France, and that Edward practically ignored her, giving his attention to Piers. Of course, this meant great resentment built within Isabella towards both men. In time, Piers meant an early death, and his enemies would have hoped that would have meant an improvement for the king without this distraction. However, in time, there would be a new favourite in the form of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh rose hugely in wealth and power because of his closeness to the king, and of course along with this gained enemies. Queen Isabella, who had been a young teenager when she arrived in England, was now far more savvy. As well as this, she had a powerful close friend with Roger Mortimer, who strongly disliked Hugh. Rather than using her energy to try and convince the king to abandon her favourite, she now wanted hers and Edward's son to become king. If this were to happen, it would in fact mean that she would be the real power in England, as her son was still too young to rule. So Isabella, her son, also called Edward, and Mortimer invaded England. King Edward had very little support, and Hugh, like Galveston before him, met a violent death. Edward tried to remain strong as king, but after immense pressure was put on him, he abdicated, meaning his son would now be king and Isabella would be in control. The former king was kept in a castle, but having him alive meant there could always be a threat that he could regain power. There were plots, which of course would have been the last thing Isabella wanted to deal with. In late 1327, the new king was told his father had died, and it all seemed very mysterious. Many believed that he was in fact murdered and that Isabella and Mortimer had been involved in the plan to kill him. One of the very grim theories about this death is that they needed to be rid of him but not have it obvious that he was murdered. So it's been suggested that he was in fact killed when a red-hot poker was shoved violently into his rectum. This would certainly kill him, but crucially not leave obvious scars on the body which would clearly show he'd been murdered. If this is truly how he died, it's an incredibly cruel thing to do, no matter how much he may have been hated. Some have suggested this theory is false, and that he was in fact alive many years later. William II. This is a particularly interesting death, as it's unclear if this was a freak accident or a murder. William II, who would become known as William Rufus, was the third-born child of William the Conqueror, who famously won the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and became the first Norman king of England. William took the throne after his father's death in 1087 and ruled for just under 13 years. A lot of things written about William as king are unfavourable. He made unpopular decisions, especially about the church, where he had many conflicts. On top of this, he was said to be lacking in morals, drank too much, took too much money for his own personal wealth, and, due to having many attractive young men at his court, was possibly homosexual. If he was gay, this certainly doesn't mean he would be a bad king or a person, but this was nearly 1,000 years ago, and attitudes were of course hugely different than that of today. And possibly, if there is truth to this, his noblemen, who were so necessary for the king's success, may have disliked him for it. Some of these accounts have to be looked at with skepticism, as often they were written by enemies, especially some of those from the church who were no fan of William. Whether it's true and justified or not, historically, I would say William is looked at as a bad king. But the biggest intrigue has to be the strange circumstances surrounding his death. while in his early 40s he went hunting in the summer of 1100. It's pretty much impossible to put an exact picture of what happened that day, as reports can be conflicting. But supposedly, at some point on the outing, William was shot by an arrow by one of his men, commonly believed to be the nobleman Walter Tyrrell. William and Tyrrell seemingly became separated from the group while chasing a stag, and the king was killed with an arrow supposedly fired by Tyrrell intended to hit the stag, which instead hit his chest. Historian William of Malmesbury wrote that the night before his death, the king had dreamed he would die and meet the devil the next day. If this were true, it would be an extremely eerie coincidence. Being very unpopular with some people, this death was not necessarily seen as an awful thing, as it meant the people were rid of a bad king. Throughout history, the big question has always been, was this done deliberately? Of course, we can't say for sure either way, but certainly William had many enemies, and it's thought that Tyrrell was very skilled with the bow and arrow, suggesting he would have been unlikely to make such an error. If it was deliberate, was this a pre-planned thing, or was it done on the spur of the moment when an opportunity presented itself? It's crazy to consider all the possibilities. In a move that could be argued it made him look very guilty, or a great scapegoat, Tyrrell fled to France immediately after the accident. Supposedly, he said in later life that he was not even with the king at the time of the accident. In reality, unpleasant accidents and deaths were far more common back then, so it seems people moved on pretty quickly. Everyone's far more interested in the new king Henry I than worrying about what had happened to William. Richard Roos. Richard Roos is an individual that would have been forgotten long ago, but he is remembered for having a very unpleasant death in 1532 after it's thought he was guilty of poisoning. So Roos was possibly the cook, or the friend of the cook, in the household of John Fisher. Fisher was quite an important man in Tudor England. He was made bishop by King Henry VII and was involved in the education of his son, the future Henry VIII. Once Henry VIII was king, however, he did not always see eye to eye with Fisher, and when the king tried to divorce his first wife, the bishop was vocally against it. Having the king, especially one like Henry angry with you, was never good news, and Fisher would have gained himself enemies who disagreed with him, such as the Boleyns. Anne Boleyn was of course the woman Henry VIII wanted to marry after his divorce was successful, so it was certainly in hers and her whole family's interest to not have people speaking against them. In 1531, some of the servants in Fisher's household died after eating some pottage prepared in the bishop's house. Others became unwell, although survived, and the bishop himself was completely unharmed. But the deaths led to suspicions that the whole thing had been an attempt to kill the bishop by poisoning. Was Roos guilty? It's hard to say. Supposedly he actually confessed, saying it was meant to be a joke, but it's thought torture was used in the investigation. And in those circumstances, how can you trust anything that is said? Meaning possibly an innocent man faced a horrific death. Could it be that someone who wanted to see the king divorced was somehow involved in the murder attempt? The Boleyns were on the verge of rising higher than they ever could have dreamed possible if Anne were to become queen, and some suspected they could have been involved. These may just be hyped up rumours created by the Boleyns' enemies who would do anything to weaken them in the dog-eat-dog Tudor world. Realistically, without very good evidence, it's hard to prove anything back then. Some have even suggested the king himself may have been somehow involved, but only those with a death wish would openly say that. Henry VIII had a fear of being poisoned himself, and he made the punishment being boiled alive for those guilty of killing with poison. Roos was given no opportunity to defend himself. He was chained and brought to Smithfields, and there in front of a crowd he was boiled to death. Supposedly, this form of execution is not quick, with it taking around 2 hours for him to die in what must have been terrible pain. Thankfully, this brutal form of execution does not seem to have been used often, at least in Tudor England, although it was certainly used elsewhere. Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. Margaret was born in 1473 during the Wars of the Roses, and she was in fact the daughter of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, and the niece of Yorkist King Edward IV. You might assume that she was a casualty of the wars, but in fact she lived until way after, in 1541. But having that Plantagenet link would hang over her once the Tudors came to power in 1485. Tudor King Henry VII was insecure about his place as king, and the Plantagenets, who were so close to the throne, would always be seen as a threat to the Tudors. It shows how concerned King Henry was that he in fact locked up Margaret's child brother Edward in the Tower and had him killed while still only in his 20s. Despite some difficult circumstances, Margaret seemed to have a pretty good life. She was married to Richard Pole, an ally of Henry VII, and they had several children. She became Countess of Salisbury, which would have given her wealth. She also became a lady and close friend to Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and godmother to the Princess Mary, so she was clearly in a really good position and close to the royal family. Margaret was Catholic, as was her son Reginald. When Henry VIII tried to divorce Catherine and break with Rome, Reginald left England and was very vocally against the king. It didn't end at words though. He was put in charge of a rebellion against the king to try and restore the Catholic faith. Henry was furious with anyone who tried to do anything to stop him getting his divorce. But he could not do much about Reginald, who was out of the country. So his fury turned in the direction of his family, including Margaret. In her 60s, Margaret was brought to the Tower, where she was now called a traitor. She remained there for some time, and finally, aged 67, it was decided she would die by beheading. Now, getting your head cut off in the Tudor world was not a super uncommon way to die. I mean, 2 of Henry VIII's wives were killed this way, so it was pretty much a death that anyone could face. But the circumstances of this beheading are not pleasant, to say the least. There are several accounts of the events of this execution, so it's hard to say for sure what happened, but it was said the executioner completely messed up and swung the axe multiple times in the attempt to remove her head. This would of course been agony for poor Margaret, being hit but not enough to be killed. It's also said that Margaret attempted to run from the executioner while he continued to try and kill her, and ultimately she suffered more than 10 strokes of the axe before she died. Being beheaded, in theory, would have been one of the more favourable ways to be executed back then, as it should be quick and clean. But there are other famous cases of the axe being swung multiple times with people, but this has to go down as one of the most horrendous beheadings in history. George, Duke of Clarence. So Margaret, who I just spoke about, was in fact the daughter of this man, but he died many years before her. He was born in 1449 and was an important person in the Wars of the Roses. His older brother became King Edward IV after winning a battle and taking the throne from Lancastrian King Henry VI. This would seemingly have been a great thing for George, as he was now very close to the crown and became a duke. But maybe being so close to power, but not the top dog, was something he found hard to handle. His relationship with his brother the king was not the easiest. George disliked and mistrusted Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth, and George's own marriage to the powerful Earl of Warwick's daughter caused problems with the king. Warwick, George's father-in-law, who was known as the Kingmaker, had been a big supporter of Edward's rise to become king. But after they fell out, the Kingmaker and George started plotting against him. In time, George did return to his brother's side, and the Kingmaker was killed in battle, but the damage done by George's betrayal would create lasting tensions with Edward. Over time, George became more erratic and paranoid. He was convinced his wife had been poisoned by enemies. He continued to have problems with the king and queen, and his younger brother, the future King Richard III. It seems at this point he was unstable and dangerous. He was accused of plotting the king's death, which was a big no-no, and he was sent to the Tower and eventually sentenced to die. It's possible George's bad relationship with the Queen contributed to his downfall, as she felt he was a threat to her children inheriting the throne. His death took place in the Tower, and although there are different theories, many historians have said similar things about his execution. Supposedly, he was drowned in wine. It's possible that as a traitor, he was originally condemned to a worse execution, but maybe his mother intervened with the king and instead he was drowned. Some have actually suggested that George himself requested this form of execution. After his death, it's been said that Edward felt guilty and even regretted his brother's death. But by that point, it was too late.